The scripture reading today comes from Matthew 22, 34 through 40. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. All right. If you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn in them to Matthew 22. Just going to get set up here really quick. Matthew 22. If you remember, we are in a series on We Are Sola and talking about who we are as a church, what makes us distinctive, what we believe are kind of important elements about ourselves. Last week we talked about the true story. And we need to come back to the true story fairly often to anchor ourselves in the narrative that we believe we find ourselves in and see what is our place in it. What is the true story? In the same way we talked last week, like in Toy Story, Buzz needs to be aligned to the true story, that they are there, they exist to be there for Andy. We exist to love God and to love our neighbors. And we're going to look at that today. So if you have Matthew 22 open there, we're here at the end of the chapter in Matthew 22. Eventually, we're going to get to this point in our Matthew series, and we're going to spend some more time in this passage. But just from a high-level overview, what's going on in this passage is you've got these three groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians, and they are all trying to trip Jesus up. They are coming up and asking him all of these questions. So, for example, the Pharisees and the Herodians, they get together. They come up to Jesus and they're like, "Hey, is it okay to pay taxes to Caesar?" And the Pharisees are like, "Well, if he says yes, then he's for our oppressors, and we can trap him, and then then we can tell everybody that he is against the Jews because he's for Rome." The Herodians were on the side of Herod. They were supporters of the empire. So if he says no, they're going to go tattle to Herod and say, "There's this guy that's going around, and he's telling people, they don't have to serve Caesar. They don't have to serve you either." And so it's like, okay, we got him. We've got this trick no matter what he says. And he tells them, like, "Let me see a coin." And he takes the coin. He's like, whose picture is this? "Oh, it's Caesar's. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's." And they're all like, "I don't know what to do with that." Okay? They walk away. The Sadducees ask him a question. They're like, "Okay, so this guy gets married, has no children, he dies. So his brother marries the woman, has no children, he dies. And there's 7 brothers, and they go all the way to the youngest brother, and then both the man and the wife die at the end." In the resurrection, remember, the Sadducees, if you didn't know this, the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. The Pharisees were the ones that believed, and it gets really interesting because eventually Paul, in Acts, he's going to pit them against each other. There's this huge trial, and Paul is like, "I'm being persecuted for my views on the resurrection." And then all of a sudden, all the Pharisees and Sadducees fight with each other, and Paul kind of escapes. But the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection, and Jesus has been preaching about the resurrection. So they come to him and they say, "Whose wife is she in the resurrection then?" And Jesus basically just tells them, "You don't know anything about resurrection or the life hereafter. You have no idea what you're talking about." And they quickly realize that they don't. Okay, so we get to this passage where Savannah read to us. And verse 34, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, this is where we're at. Everybody's trying to trip him up. The Pharisees hear, "Oh man, the Sadducees were unsuccessful with their little trick question. Let's try one more." And one of the lawyers asked a question to test him. I don't know if you ever watch any lawyer dramas or cop dramas or courtroom type dramas. But you understand that idea of a lawyer asking these questions, trying to get somebody to trip themselves up. They will ask questions and then come back and try to show, oh, you weren't really honest with your question. Or, trick them into admitting something that they didn't want to admit on the stand. That is kind of the role of the lawyer. And so here this lawyer comes up to Jesus, and he wants Jesus to make some kind of declaration that they can use later on in order to trip Jesus up. Okay? So the lawyer asks him this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Out of all of the law, there's hundreds of commandments in the law. Out of all the law, the prophets, the Torah, what is the greatest commandment? What would you boil it down to? And Jesus just gives him a straight answer. And he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind." He basically just quotes Deuteronomy 6:5. Deuteronomy 6:5 says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your might." Just quotes Scripture right back to him. And then he adds something to it. He goes on and quotes Leviticus 19:18. Leviticus 19:18 says this, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh." So he quotes Deuteronomy, and then he says, "And the second commandment is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then he says something that kind of pertains to his question. The question was, what was the greatest commandment of the law? He brings it back to the question and says, on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. In other words, you can boil all the law and the prophets like they all hang on these two ideas. And in fact, if you look at the 10 commandments, you get this idea. Like the first 4 are basically love God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make any graven images, right? Remember the Sabbath day. All of these are how we relate to God. And then the others are how we relate to our neighbor. If you just loved your neighbor well, we probably wouldn't have to have rules about thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or all of his stuff. Okay? So here, all of these laws and commandments hang on these two ideas. Love God, love your neighbor well. And what we see is as Jesus is launching the church and launching his kingdom, he's going to continually come back to this, and his followers are going to continually come back to this. In fact, at the end of John, when Jesus is getting ready, like this is right, like the chapter before he is going to crucifixion, here's what he tells his disciples. "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you're my disciples, if you have love one for another." So what is the defining feature of the church supposed to be? It's that we love each other really, really well. This is how we are meant to be known. In 1 Corinthians 13, Paul connects with this. He says, "Now faith, hope, and love abide, these three. But the greatest of these is what? Love." In 1 Corinthians, the Corinthians are squabbling about spiritual gifts and which spiritual gift is the best. And I want prophecy. I think prophecy is the best. But tongues is super cool. And healing, that would be super awesome. So, Paul, which one of these is actually the best gift? And Paul tells them in 1 Corinthians 12, "Let me show you a more excellent way." We get 1 Corinthians 13 where Paul talks about love suffers long and is kind, love envies not, love vaunteth not itself. I still remember it in the old King James. Right? But he gets to the end, he says, out of all of these things, faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these is love. What should characterize you as a church, Corinthians, is not that you have this amazing faith and you have all these miracles that you're doing, that you have the hope of the resurrection. Like, those are important things. But what should really characterize you as a church is that you love each other really well. Peter also connects with this. In 1 Peter 4:8, he says this. In 1 Peter 4, he's giving them instructions about how to live as exiles in a world that is very anti-Christian. So he's talking about, avoid sexual immorality, avoid drunkenness, don't go to drunken parties. He basically is telling the people there, don't live lives like that. But above all, 1 Peter 4:8 says, above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. In other words, it's important not to go along with the world and go, sin and drink and party, like all of these things that we associate in our minds with worldliness. All of these things that I think, like if you grew up in conservative Christianity like I did, these are kind of the really defining aspects of Christianity, that we avoid those things. Peter is saying, and Paul is saying, sure, that's important, but above all else, love each other. Love one another earnestly. So what I want to do really quick, I want to review what we've talked about. I want to talk about where we are, and then I want to walk you through our mission statement and why we have the mission statement that we do. We just, like recently, I think it was 2 summers ago, rewrote it. So just by way of review. Okay, so last week we talked about our true story, right? What's the first down arrow? Shout it out. What's first down arrow? Creation. Man, that was weak. Let's try this next one. What's the X? Fall. All right. What comes next? Promise. Right? Right arrow. Okay. What was the promise? That eventually God would set all things right. Okay. So Jesus would come and to set all things right. So we have Jesus and redemption. Okay. What comes next? Church. Another right arrow. Right. And then how do we end? New creation. And we find ourselves right here. Right? This is where we are in the story. The interesting thing about the story, if you read the story in the Bible up to about this point, the expectation was that we would actually jump straight from here to here. Okay? This piece right here, they didn't realize was going to happen. There's all of these promises about new creation. There's all of these promises about the Messiah coming, setting up the kingdom of David, ruling and reigning forever and ever, and setting all things back to the way they're supposed to be, redeeming the world. And Jesus comes along, and everybody thinks, okay, it's time. Even his disciples, like 2 of his disciples, hey, Jesus, when you come in your kingdom, can I sit on your right hand and my brother on your left? When you come in your power? Like once you overthrow Rome and you set up Israel and you establish the kingdom of David, can I sit on your right hand and my brother on your left and we'll rule alongside of you in this kingdom, like with an actual physical king? Can we do that? They thought we were going to jump right to there. And instead, what Jesus does is he connects this. He pulls this new creation back into our existing age. We have another way we like to illustrate that, okay? So we call them the overlapping circles. So here's the current age. My handwriting is terrible, and more so when I'm writing with this. The current age, and then we have what we call the age to come. Okay? So here's the age to come. And everybody thought we were going to move from one circle over to the other. And the Messiah was going to show up and take us from the current age where Satan, sin, and death are ruling, right? So here's what marks the current age. Satan, sin, and death. The Messiah was going to come and just pull us and take us right into the age to come where it's characterized by God, worship, and life, right? But what Jesus did, instead of jumping straight over to that, he grabs this age to come and he pulls it into the current age. So now we exist here where we still struggle with Satan, sin, and death. But we are offered this foretaste of God, worship, and life, where we have this reality that Jesus has inaugurated his kingdom, but it's not fully here yet. We're still waiting for it to be completely filled. And in the middle, we have gospel, community, and mission. We have the good news that the kingdom is inaugurated and will one day be fully revealed. We have community, where in the age of Satan, sin, and death, remember when we talked about creation and then fall, one of the big things with the fall is that they are cast out of the presence of God. They lose fellowship with God. And not only is fellowship with God broken, but fellowship with each other is broken. Like we were made to live in community without shame. And shame is the first thing that's introduced as a result of the fall. That they are ashamed to be together, right? The first shame that they saw was they need to get clothes on, right? They were ashamed to see each other naked. And the second thing was they were ashamed to be in the presence of God. And they hid from God. And so what Jesus does is he brings this God worship, this fellowship with God, this removal of shame over, and we live in the tension here, but it's not completely gone yet. You know that. We talk all the time that like we don't need to live in shame anymore, but we do still, don't we? Like there is no shame before God. God knows everything about us and he loves us, though we still feel it very often. We know that if we're living in community the way God intended, there is no shame between us, and yet we still feel it fairly often, don't we? We're living in this tension, and so what do we do in the midst of this tension where we're living in the age of Satan, sin, and death? We still feel the effects of the fall. We still feel that shame that was part of the fall. But Jesus has inaugurated his kingdom and pulled fellowship with God, worship, and life into this current age where we have gospel, community, and mission. What do we do with that? Well, here's what we at Sola do with it. Sola Church exists to love God by living as a family of missionary servants who make disciples for the flourishing of our city. All right? When we rewrote our mission statement, we wanted it to hang just like the law and the prophets on the two great commandments. All right? And as we were talking about, like, what is our mission statement going to be? And I remember Bobby really emphasizing, hey, we need to go back to the two great commandments. And we need to make sure that whatever we're doing is hanging on those two great commandments. So Sola Church exists to love God. That's the first commandment. We exist to love. If we're not loving God well, then we're not actually following Jesus' commandments. We're not actually doing what Jesus wants. The great thing about this one is we get to love God because we, first of all, have been loved, right? We love him because he first loved us. So this love for God, this is something that the Spirit is working out in us, where the more we know about God, the more we are able to love him. The things that we learn about God are not just meant to be, mental exercises. They are meant to drive you to actually love him more. And if they're not, then we're doing it wrong. I remember growing up where a lot of my mental exercises around understanding the Bible and understanding doctrine, understanding God, were more for the sake of arguing with people into salvation as opposed to driving me to actually love God more. Do you see that? And it wasn't necessarily, like, I'm not blaming anybody for this. It was just I was a smart aleck. And I loved arguing with people. And this is what doctrine was for me. It was primarily around apologetics and being able to argue well and demonstrate my intelligence. If we are teaching you about God in a way that doesn't drive you to love him well, then we're doing it wrong. Does that make sense? So we exist, first of all, to love God. If we are loving God, how does that actually, how do we love God? If I asked you, do you love your spouse? Do you love your kids? Do you love your family? How are you demonstrating that? It is one thing to know, hey, I love my wife. How would she know that? It's not enough for me to tell her. Do you understand that? It's not enough for me just to say, I love you. How would she know that I love her? There have to be some concrete actions behind it. If I ask my kids, do you know that I love you? I would hope that they would be able to look at my actions as a father for reference to that. Does that make sense? When we say we're loving God, the question is, what does loving God then look like? One of the ways that we love God is by loving his creation, loving the other people who he has created. In other words, the second way to love God, or primary way to love God, is to actually love our neighbor. So here in the mission statement, what does it look like to love God and love neighbor? Well, first of all, we want to be living as a family of missionary servants, okay, who make disciples. I'm going to connect that there. Okay, we have this, I don't know if you've ever noticed this here, right? The family, missionary, servant, disciple. You see where that comes from? You see all those words in there? It's not just jargon. It's not just fun words that we think we're going to throw out there because they sound nice. We actually believe these are our identities. God the Father makes us family together with Him and with each other. The Holy Spirit fills us and empowers us to be on the mission that Christ was commissioned to. Jesus, as a servant, works alongside of us in our servant identity. And those three things all together, when you're doing those, that is what actually makes you a disciple of Christ. That you are family with God, that you're on mission through the Spirit. You're filled with the Spirit for the mission. You're serving alongside Jesus. That's what it actually means to be a disciple. I don't know if we've ever actually, I'm sure we have, but I want to make sure, like, whenever you see that, these are our identities, and they work together, and they're based on what we believe about God. If we love God well and we understand Him, then we are partnering together with Him in the separate identities of the Trinity. Does that make sense? So we live as a family of missionary servants. So we're going to talk more about what it means to be a family. See, we don't conceive of the church primarily as an organization. We conceive of it primarily as an organism. Our relationships here are not centered on membership in an organization, but on brother and sisterhood as a family. Okay? So often the church becomes an institution, and we want to conceive of it more as a family. And that's why we do missional communities. That's why we call you to live together as family with other people in the body. Our Sunday services are important, but they are all pushing you out to live as a family of missionary servants making disciples. That's what we do this for. If you're just coming specifically for our Sunday services, honestly, I don't know why you would be doing that. I don't know why you would come just for the Sunday services, because we're going to push you continually to live as a family of missionary servants making disciples. And then here at the end, what does it look like when we do this and we are committed to the location that God has called us? We are living as a family of missionary servants. We are working for the flourishing of our city. If we believe that we are on mission with Jesus on His inaugurated kingdom, where He is setting all things right again, then we are working in that direction as well. We are looking for the flourishing of our city. We are looking to restore shalom wherever Christ has called us to. And right now, Christ has called us to Littleton. We believe that we're here for the long term in this kind of South Denver area. And we are working towards loving our neighbors well so that shalom is restored in their lives. No, sometimes that means just bringing people into relationship and showing them what it looks like to be a family. Sometimes that means advocating for them in issues of justice. Sometimes that means like caring for their children in foster care, providing housing or assistance for single mothers on the verge of homelessness, or some of our homeless friends in the city. But we're working for the flourishing of our city, and we're focusing on the vulnerable, because James tells us religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. All right? Religion that is pure and undefiled before God is to actually work with the vulnerable in our communities. So this is our mission statement. I don't know if you've ever, hopefully you guys are familiar with it. Maybe if you're more new, you haven't seen it before. But let's go ahead and can we say it together? I would love for this to be something that we say together regularly. That if somebody asks you, what is Sola Church about? This is what we would say. We also have our tag, I forgot to mention over here, loving God for the good of our neighbor. This is like our tagline. This is our mission statement. This is kind of what our priorities are. So let's say our mission statement together, and hopefully we can just embed it in our head so we know, why are we here on Sunday mornings? Why do we organize around missional communities? Why do we exist as there are tons of churches? I know several of you probably drove by a dozen churches on the way here. Some of you who live farther probably drove by 100 churches on your way here. Why are you here? What are we doing? This is what we're doing. Let's say it together. Ready? Sola Church exists to love God by living as a family of missionary servants who make disciples for the flourishing of our city. Let's say it one more time. Sola Church exists to love God by living as a family of missionary servants who make disciples for the flourishing of our city. All right? One of the things that we need to understand, like going back to the Matthew passage, it talks about loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. And in order to love, like the way that we get to love others as ourselves is to first of all realize that we are deeply loved. You cannot love until you know that you are loved. You can't attach to others. Like going through doing foster care, we've done a lot of study of like child psychology, brain development. One of my favorite books out there about child psychology. I'd recommend it to anybody just for the stories. Even if you're not really interested in child psychology, the stories are fantastic. But it's The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. It's a really great child psychology book where they take specific examples and use them to illustrate truths. And there was one baby whose mother was mentally impaired and didn't know how to deal with a newborn. Didn't have any support around her and didn't know any better. And so what she would do is she would leave the baby all day, take an older sibling, and leave the house all day because she couldn't handle the crying, didn't know how to deal with it. And so this baby, there's like this normal attachment cycle where a baby, cries out and is soothed and the needs are met. Either it's fed, its diaper is changed. Whenever a baby's crying, it's expressing a need. And once that need is met, then they learn this whole attachment process, all right? If you're in a situation where you never attach and your needs are never met, you know what happens to that kid is they grow up to be what we consider, like medically, a sociopath, where they are not able to form attachments. They're not able to emotionally empathize with other people. And so when we look at like, how do we get to love others really well? We have to understand, first of all, that we ourselves are loved. Like, we have a primary attachment object who will never leave us, never forsake us. And the way that he demonstrated his love for us was to come, be born as a baby, live a life here on earth, and then die on the cross for our sins. Like, he went to the cross on our behalf for us. And so every week, one of the things we do is we remind ourselves of that identity that we have, that we are united with Christ, that he sacrificed himself on our behalf so that we could be rescued and be put on mission with him. So what we do every week is we take communion. We take the bread and the cup, and Jesus said, "This do in remembrance of me." Like every time you get together, every time you take the bread, take the cup, you're reminded of the sacrifice that he gave on our behalf. So if you have your communion wafers, we're going to say our call to communion, and then we'll take it together and continue worshiping.